Leo is deep in the forest, searching for his missing son, when a scream suddenly echoes through the trees. He immediately raises his rifle and moves toward the sound. As he gets closer, he notices a few bear cubs standing nearby. And then, disaster strikes. A massive grizzly charges out of nowhere and slams into him. The beast tears into his back with its jaws, then starts shredding him with its claws. Leo screams in agony as the attack turns brutally violent. The bear keeps throwing him around like a rag doll until he's barely able to move. Then it plants a giant paw on his head. Leo stays completely still. He knows one wrong move will get him killed. After a tense moment, the bear finally assumes he's dead and starts walking away. Leo grabs his rifle and fires. Huge mistake. The wounded grizzly spins around and attacks again. One swipe rips open his throat, and seconds later, its jaws clamp down on his shoulder. But the bear is weakening too. Seeing his only chance, Leo pulls out a knife and fights back with everything he has left. The struggle ends when both of them tumble down a steep slope. They crash violently downhill until the nearly 900-pound bear lands directly on top of Leo and finally dies. Hours later, Leo is still alive, barely. He drags himself back to camp, collects whatever supplies he can find, and wraps himself in the bear hide for warmth. Desperate for food, he reaches the rotting carcass of a buffalo, breaks open a bone, and eats whatever meat remains inside. It's disgusting, but starving to death would be worse. Continuing his painful journey, Leo eventually reaches a river and tries to drink. That's when he discovers how serious his injuries really are. The wound in his throat is so deep that the water leaks right back out. Food can wait, water can't. Thinking fast, he gathers dry grass, pours gunpowder onto it, and rubs some into his wound. After managing to start a fire, he slowly brings the flame toward his throat. The pain is unbearable. Seconds later, he passes out. A crow watching from a nearby branch thinks it's about to get an easy meal. Instead, it becomes Leo's meal. The tiny bird barely helps, so he starts digging up roots and eating them just to stay alive. Then he hears movement. Turning around, he spots a herd of deer crossing the river. Normally, it would be an easy hunt, but without his rifle, there's nothing he can do. Out of habit, he even points a stick like a gun and pretends to fire. Later, while carving his name into a rock, he hears horses approaching. The moment he looks up, he recognizes them, a hostile tribe. And if they find him, he's dead. Leo quickly hides behind a massive boulder, but one of the warriors heads down to the river and spots him anyway. The second he's discovered, Leo dives into the water and lets the current carry him away. Arrows rain down from above, but he slips underwater just in time. As the river pulls him downstream, memories come flooding back. The son he came into this wilderness to find is already dead, and the man responsible wasn't an enemy. It was one of Leo's own trusted friends, who murdered the boy for just $300. Now Leo isn't searching anymore. He's hunting. He's after revenge. For now, though, survival comes first. The river eventually carries him far beyond the tribe's reach. Clinging to a floating log, he manages to reach shore again. The freezing air cuts through him. His body shakes uncontrollably, but somehow he's still alive. When he checks his injuries, he discovers something terrifying. The wounds are already beginning to rot. Even so, stopping isn't an option. Using his hunting skills, Leo arranges stones in the river to create a simple fish trap. Before long, a fish swims right into it. He's so hungry, he doesn't even cook it. He devours it raw. Suddenly, a strange sound comes from nearby. Leo crawls up a small rise and looks ahead. What he sees is unbelievable. Thousands of wild buffalo are stampeding across a frozen plain. And right in the middle of them, one buffalo has been completely surrounded by a pack of wolves. But the truly shocking part is to be continued.
The shocking part was that even with thousands of buffalo surrounding the scene, not a single one came to help. Leo stayed hidden and waited for the wolves to finish. His plan was to move in afterward and eat whatever scraps were left behind, but someone beat him to it. In the distance, he spotted a warrior from the hostile tribe carrying a torch. The man waved the fire around, scaring off the wolves and claiming the carcass for himself. Under normal circumstances, Leo would have stayed far away, but he was starving. Taking a huge risk, he slowly approached. The tribesman was tearing into raw meat when he noticed Leo. Instantly, he grabbed his bow and aimed. Leo immediately raised his hands, dropped to his knees, and made it clear he didn't want trouble. Then he pointed to himself and begged for food through gestures. The warrior watched him carefully. Only after realizing Leo wasn't a threat did he lower his weapon. Even then, he kept eating While Leo sat there, desperately trying to explain how long he'd been starving, finally, the man tossed him a piece of meat. Leo attacked it like a wild animal. For the first time in days, he had a full stomach, and seconds later, exhaustion knocked him out beside the fire. The next morning, the tribesmen examined Leo's injuries. The wounds looked terrible. An infection had already started spreading. Using gestures, Leo explained the bear attack and showed the deep claw marks covering his body. The evidence spoke for itself. From that moment on, the warrior trusted him. The two men began traveling together, heading south through the frozen wilderness, with Leo riding on the man's spotted horse. At the same time, Fitz, the man who murdered Leo's son for $300, was also moving south, doing everything he could to stay alive and avoid being caught. After covering a long distance, Leo and his companion stopped beneath a dead tree to rest. Snow drifted quietly through the air. For a brief moment, the endless pain, fear, and struggle seemed to disappear, but that peace didn't last. Soon, a brutal blizzard rolled in. The storm became so intense that they could barely see a few feet ahead. The tribesman guided the horse through the whiteout, while Leo struggled to stay conscious. His injuries, hunger, and exhaustion were finally catching up with him. Then, he collapsed. Leo fell from the horse and blacked out. A severe fever had taken over. The tribesman reacted immediately. He cut down part of a tree, built a small shelter, started a fire, and heated stones to create warmth. Then, he treated Leo's infected wounds with medicinal herbs and carefully packed the shelter to trap heat inside. Throughout the freezing night, he did everything possible to keep Leo alive. When Leo finally opened his eyes the next morning, the storm was gone. His fever had broken. For the first time since the bear attack, he actually felt stronger. And now, with a loyal ally by his side and revenge still driving him forward, Leo was finally ready to continue the hunt. Felt better than he had in days. His fever was gone, his strength was returning, and for the first time since the bear attack, survival seemed possible. But there was one problem. The tribesman who had saved his life had vanished. Before leaving, though, the man had left food and water behind for Leo. It was one final act of kindness from the person who had kept him alive when death seemed certain. After gathering his supplies, Leo continued south. Not long afterward, he stopped dead in his tracks. The tribesman was hanging from a tree. A wooden sign had been strapped to his body, and it was obvious he had been murdered and displayed as a warning. Leo didn't need long to figure out who had done it. The French trappers, a brutal group known for their cruelty toward indigenous tribes. Soon after, Leo located their camp. The men were relaxing around a fire, eating, laughing, and acting as if nothing had happened. Then he noticed something else. A young indigenous girl was being held captive there. The second Leo saw her, he decided he was getting her out. But attacking during the day would have been suicide, so he waited for nightfall. Once darkness covered the camp, Leo quietly slipped inside. His plan was simple: free the girl, steal the spotted horse, and disappear before anyone noticed. At first, everything went perfectly. Then one of the Frenchmen started dragging the girl toward the exact spot where Leo was hiding. Watching from the shadows, Leo realized why they were keeping her prisoner. It wasn't for ransom. The sight filled him with rage. Silently, he moved closer, grabbed a rifle, and aimed it at the man's head. Then he untied the horse and prepared to escape. Everything was seconds from success. Then a nearby horse let out a loud neigh. The entire camp heard it. Instantly, the Frenchmen grabbed their weapons and rushed toward the noise. With no time left, Leo opened fire. Gunshots shattered the silence. The camp exploded into chaos as men shouted and ran in every direction. Using the confusion, Leo and the girl escaped separately into the darkness before anyone could stop them. After putting distance between himself and the camp, Leo finally rested beside a fire and drifted off to sleep with his rifle clutched tightly against his chest. But danger wasn't finished with him. The next morning, several indigenous warriors arrived searching for the missing girl. Leo had barely opened his eyes when an arrow slammed into the ground nearby. Instantly awake, he realized he was under attack. He grabbed his gear, jumped onto the spotted horse, and took off at full speed. The warriors chased him immediately. As he rode, Leo kept firing behind him, trying to slow them down, but there were too many of them. Then disaster struck. A massive ravine suddenly appeared ahead. There was no time to stop. Leo and the horse plunged straight over the edge. They crashed hundreds of feet below into the frozen wilderness. Somehow, Leo survived. The horse wasn't so lucky. The fall left the animal too badly injured to continue, and at the same time, a brutal blizzard began sweeping across the landscape. The temperature kept dropping. The wind howled. Snow blasted through the air. Leo knew exactly what that meant. Without shelter, he would freeze to death. With no other choice, he made a desperate survival decision. He cut open the horse's belly, removed the organs, stripped off his wet clothes, and climbed inside the carcass to use its its remaining body heat. It was horrifying, but it worked. Curled inside the dead horse, while the storm raged outside, Leo eventually fell asleep. When he woke the next morning, everything was silent. The blizzard had passed. During the night, snow had completely buried the horse. Using the last of his strength, Leo pushed through the frozen opening and crawled back into the daylight. Fresh air filled his lungs. For a moment, he simply sat there, breathing. Then he climbed out completely and checked his surroundings. No enemies, no movement, just endless snow stretching to the horizon. Before leaving, Leo turned back toward the horse one final time. The animal had saved his life. Quietly, he thanked it. Then he continued his journey alone. Against a landscape of endless frozen plains and towering mountains, Leo looked like nothing more than a tiny figure crossing a vast white wilderness. And as darkness slowly began to fall, his fight for survival was far from over.
As night fell, Leo squeezed himself between two rocks to escape the freezing wind. Shivering in the darkness, only one thought kept replaying in his head: Fitz killed my son. That obsession was the only thing keeping him alive. Meanwhile, back at the fort, members of Leo's tribe were questioning a captured French trapper. They wanted to know if his people had taken one of their warriors prisoner. The man denied it repeatedly. According to him, the only captive they'd been holding was an indigenous girl. Then a wounded French hunter arrived wearing a bear hide. He reported that a man matching Leo's description had attacked their camp and escaped south with both the girl and a horse. The tribe immediately knew who it was. Leo was alive. Without hesitation, they formed a search party and headed into the wilderness. They searched through the day and deep into the night, refusing to give up. Then a gunshot suddenly echoed across the frozen landscape. Every rider turned toward the sound. Moments later, a lone figure emerged from the darkness and slowly approached. As he stepped into the torchlight, everyone froze. It was Leo. Somehow, after everything he'd endured, he was still alive. The chief rushed over, and Leo was brought safely back to camp. His wounds were finally cleaned and treated properly. But before he could rest, he received another piece of news. Fitz had abandoned the tribe and fled south toward Texas. The moment Leo heard that, his mission became clear again. The hunt wasn't over. He and the chief immediately mounted horses and rode out to track Fitz down once and for all. After crossing miles of frozen wilderness, they found horse tracks in the snow. Leo recognized them instantly. They belonged to Fitz. Finally, they had a lead. They followed the trail for hours until darkness forced them to stop. At sunrise, the pursuit continued and eventually led them deep into a forest. That's when Leo caught the smell of smoke. Someone had camped there recently. Sensing Fitz was close, Leo split up with the chief. The chief moved east while Leo circled from the west, hoping to trap him. Not long after, Leo discovered the remains of a campfire. The ashes were still warm, but Fitz was gone. At the same time, the chief entered a clearing. Suddenly, Fitz stepped out from behind a rock with a rifle already aimed. The chief reached for his weapon. Too late. A gunshot rang out. The instant Leo heard it, he sprinted toward the sound. But when he arrived, it was already over. The chief lay dead in the snow. For a moment, Leo could only stare. Then he heard another distant roar. High in the mountains, a massive avalanche was crashing down a slope. The sight gave him a clue. He knew which direction Fitz had escaped. Determined not to lose him, Leo carried the chief's body and continued toward the mountains. Later, while crossing an open stretch of frozen ground with no cover in sight, Fitz spotted him from a distance. He raised his rifle and fired. The figure collapsed. Thinking he'd finally killed Leo, Fitz rode over to confirm it. Then he realized he'd been tricked. The body in the snow wasn't Leo, it was the chief. Leo had used the corpse as a decoy. The second Fitz understood what happened, panic set in. Wounded, exhausted, and running out of options, he turned and fled into the forest. Leo saw him run. All the rage he'd been carrying exploded to the surface. He grabbed his rifle and charged after him. The final chase had begun. A short time later, Fitz disappeared into the thick woods, but Leo wasn't letting him escape again. Slowly, rifle in hand, he entered the fog-covered forest. Nearby, Fitz hid behind a tree, waiting for the perfect shot. The fog was so dense that neither man could clearly see the other. He kicked Leo backward and slashed him again as both men bled into the snow. But Leo wasn't stopping. He struck again with the axe, wounded Fitz once more, then tackled him to the ground and wrapped his hands around his throat. This time, Fitz knew he was finished. Looking directly at Leo, he asked one last question. What do you gain by killing me? Will it bring your son back? For the first time, Leo hesitated. Then he heard horses approaching. Across the river, a group of indigenous riders appeared, and in that moment, Leo remembered his wife, the visions, the memories. Everything he'd been carrying since his son's death suddenly felt different. The hatred that had kept him alive had finally burned itself out. Without saying another word, Leo dragged Fitz to the river and threw him into the current. Fitz was swept away instantly, but his escape lasted only seconds. The riders pulled him from the water. Among them was the chief whose daughter Leo had rescued from the French camp. As Fitz screamed for help, the tribe delivered its own justice. His story ended there. The warriors then crossed the river and approached Leo, but they didn't attack him. They already knew what he had done for the chief's daughter. Because of that, they spared his life. And just like that, the long hunt was over. The revenge that had carried Leo across frozen mountains, deadly rivers, brutal storms, and impossible odds was finally finished. For the first time since his son's death, there was no enemy left to chase, no score left to settle, only silence. Then Leo saw her, his wife, standing peacefully before him, smiling, waiting. And in that moment, he finally understood. The journey wasn't about revenge. It was about surviving long enough to find peace. Leo slowly looks ahead one final time. A man who survived a grizzly attack, starvation, freezing wilderness, and a relentless quest for vengeance. Now standing completely alone, but finally at peace. And with that final look, the story comes to an end.